On the night of February 28, 2026, the world awoke to shock and alarm. What had seemed like simmering tensions in the Middle East suddenly erupted into one of the most consequential military confrontations in decades. The United States and Israel launched coordinated military strikes against targets inside Iran, purportedly aimed at crippling Iran's nuclear program and destabilizing its leadership. The strikes inflicted major damage, including on areas associated with Iran's supreme leader and military infrastructure. Iran responded with widespread missile and drone attacks against U.S. and Israeli positions across the region, triggering an escalatory spiral that now threatens global security and stability. Amid this unfolding crisis, China has emerged with a consistent and strategic posture rooted in its long-standing diplomatic principles: respect for sovereignty, opposition to unilateral military action, and advocacy for peace through dialogue. But Beijing's stance is not merely rhetorical. It reflects China's evolving role on the world stage, its interpretation of national interest, and its vision of how great powers, especially non-Western ones, should shape the rules of international politics. At the epicenter of China's response are official statements from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and China's delegation to the United Nations. Almost immediately after news broke of the U.S.-Israel strikes, Beijing issued a clear call for restraint and an immediate cessation of hostilities. China's foreign ministry stated that it was highly concerned about the military actions and urged all parties to halt combat operations to prevent further escalation. The statement emphasized that Iran's sovereignty, security, and territorial integrity must be respected, and that all disputes should be resolved through dialogue and negotiations rather than force. These calls are rooted in China's frequent invocation of the UN Charter principles: sovereignty, non-interference, and peaceful dispute resolution, which Beijing cites as the basis for a stable international order. At the emergency United Nations Security Council meeting on this crisis, China's permanent representative to the UN, Fu Song, reiterated these arguments, expressing deep concern and shock over the attacks and stressing that the use of force only exacerbates conflict and risks civilian harm. He called for full respect for international humanitarian law and urged the resumption of political negotiations at the earliest opportunity. Beyond diplomatic statements, China took practical measures to protect its citizens in the region. China's embassy in Israel advised Chinese nationals to move to safer areas or depart for Egypt. Similarly, it encouraged Chinese citizens in Iran to leave the country via multiple land routes, reflecting an acute awareness of the conflict's unpredictability and its potential to affect even distant foreign nationals. From the outside, China's stance might appear cautious, even detached, compared to the fierce rhetoric coming from the US, Iran, or Israel. But a closer look shows Beijing is projecting a coherent strategic worldview. China's response reflects three main pillars. First, peace above military solutions. China's public statements consistently emphasize dialogue over military action and the urgent need for all parties to avoid unilateral use of force that could deepen the crisis. It echoes China's long-held view that wars in the modern nuclear age are existentially dangerous, and that major powers have a responsibility to prevent, not inflame, conflicts. Beijing's position criticizes the strikes indirectly, not by explicitly condemning one side as good or the other as bad, but by framing any use of force as destabilizing and counterproductive. It reflects a diplomatic style that seeks normative language grounded in international law rather than emotional rhetoric. Second, strong respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity. China's emphasis on sovereignty is not rhetorical, it is rooted in Beijing's worldview, shaped by its historical experiences, including century-long foreign incursions, and the centrality of non-interference in its foreign policy. In China's view, violations of another state's sovereignty, even for seemingly justified security reasons, set dangerous precedents that could one day be invoked against other nations, including itself. Third, avoiding escalation and spillover effects. Beijing's statements explicitly warn against escalation and spillover that could engulf neighboring states or the wider international system. The message is clear: a wider Middle East war would have global economic, humanitarian, and security consequences, affecting energy markets, international trade, regional stability, and millions of ordinary people. China has always positioned itself as a champion of common, comprehensive, cooperative, and sustainable security, and its response to this crisis reflects that philosophical commitment. While China's official responses highlight restraint and peace, interpreting them requires understanding what Beijing is signaling indirectly. China's statements do not offer any endorsement of the US or Israeli actions, even as the US and Israel justify their strikes based on preventing Iran's nuclear capability. Instead, Beijing's call for dialogue implicitly rebukes military solutions in favor of diplomacy. That is significant. It contrasts sharply with Washington's narrative that force was a lawful and necessary measure to halt potential nuclearization. China does not accept that logic; instead, it frames the strikes themselves as destabilizing and counter to peace efforts. Despite its support for diplomatic resolution and respect for sovereignty, Beijing has not declared a military alliance with Iran or promised weapons or direct intervention. Unlike Russia, which is closely tied to Iran through arms transfers and strategic cooperation, China's engagement remains diplomatic and economic rather than military. That reflects China's broader approach. It avoids entanglements that could compel it to take sides in direct combat, while still asserting principles that give it moral and diplomatic leverage. By urging ceasefires, calling for renewed negotiations, and highlighting respect for international law, China seeks to portray itself as a champion of peace and stability, especially in contrast to what it frames as unilateral military actions by Western powers. This narrative has a dual audience. Internationally, China is a responsible great power with a legitimate leadership role in global governance. Domestically, it wants to reinforce national pride in a foreign policy that projects strength without appearing aggressive. The Chinese government carefully crafts messaging around international crises to reinforce national unity and pride. China would rather have peace than war, but it is prepared and confident should its interests or security be threatened. This strategic tone, peaceful but resolute, is mirrored in China's response to the Iran crisis. China's position balances the desire for peace, the warning that unilateral military aggression is destabilizing, and the need for multilateral conflict resolution and respect for international norms. That appeals to domestic audiences who value both national confidence and stability in a world perceived as fraught with geopolitical risk. Beijing's emphasis on diplomacy over military action reinforces a broader narrative that China seeks peaceful development, avoiding entanglements in overseas wars while building economic influence. That contrasts with Western powers, which are often prone to military intervention. For many in China, political stability and economic growth are priorities above everything else. China's leadership frames its foreign policy as protective of these goals. Positioning China as a voice of restraint in a major conflict enhances the legitimacy of that narrative at home. China's reaction does not exist in a vacuum. It must be understood against the broader backdrop of global power dynamics, including China, U.S. strategic competition, Middle East geopolitics, and shifting alliances. Russia has also condemned the U.S. and Israel strikes, calling them an unprovoked act of aggression, a strikingly similar framing to China's official stance. Both Beijing and Moscow requested the Security Council meeting and called for an immediate halt to hostilities. This alignment reflects a shared interest in curbing unilateral Western military influence, especially the U.S., and in promoting diplomatic mechanisms, at least rhetorically. European nations such as France, Germany, and the UK have taken more cautious or balanced positions, expressing concern about escalation while not directly condemning the attacks as Beijing does. They emphasize civilian protection and diplomacy, but also avoid overtly criticizing U.S. policy, highlighting divergent strategic priorities among global powers. Many countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America have expressed concern about the conflict, emphasizing respect for sovereignty and the need to resume diplomacy. China's position aligns with many of these states' preferences, offering Beijing an opportunity to strengthen its image among the global South. The Iran crisis could become a defining moment in how China projects power and influence on the world stage. China's response strengthens its claim to be a responsible global power advocating peace and multilateral diplomacy, even in the face of major power conflict. Beijing's decision not to offer direct military support or to engage in confrontation with the U.S., even as it criticized the strikes, suggests that China seeks diplomatic influence rather than military confrontation. that reduces the risk of direct conflict with the US while maintaining China's strategic autonomy. While China has not overtly offered to mediate, its emphasis on dialogue and ceasefire lays the groundwork for a possible future diplomatic role. If the conflict deepens, China may seek to position itself as a broker or facilitator of a negotiated settlement. China's response to the US and Israel military strikes on Iran reflects a comprehensive strategic posture. Firm in principles, advocating respect for sovereignty and international law. Measured in rhetoric, balancing calls for peace with implicit criticism of military action. Aware of global impact, highlighting the risk of broader regional and international instability. Focused on diplomacy, urging negotiation and dialogue rather than escalation. In a world where conflicts increasingly cross borders and affect global stability, China's stance signifies a desire to lead through peace, responsibility, and strategic patience. It is an approach that resonates with domestic values and appeals to many states wary of great power military dominance. Yet, it must also be seen in the context of China's own interests and geopolitical positioning. Whether this posture will solidify China's role as a global peacemaker, a cautious strategist, or something in between remains to be seen. What is clear, however, is that in this moment of crisis, Beijing has sought to balance strength with restraint, and to frame its image not as a participant in conflict but as one of its most ardent critics and advocates for peace. Still, China is well prepared for any surprises, unlike Venezuela or Iran.